can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, alrighty. So thanks a lot to Goldie and Nisha for colouring me into doing this, because I don't often get much time to read books, let alone engage with them in the way I'm going to have to try. Well, I am going to engage this. So I'm going to do something which is quite unusual for me, which is I'm going to read something that I've written in response to the book as I've been reading. Well, as I've been reading it, I've been writing this response over the last how long? A couple of weeks since I got it, and it is a beautiful book. I don't know if we're doing enough sort of showing off. You can't see it because of all these backgrounds I've got going on. Oh, I disappear. That's quite nice. But anyway, someone can wave the book. It is a lovely little book, and so you should all go out and buy it. Ah, there you go. Yes, thanks, Nish. Yeah, you should all go out and buy this book. It's really great, and there are a lot of old friends here who kind of mean that I can't blag at all in this. So I should open up by saying that really it's only chapter 2 in the book, which Malcolm has not referred to at all, to which I can relate musically, though I feel I could push a bit into the 90s as well here, Malcolm. So, the book does start in the 80s with sound systems and reggae sound systems, and then it moves on to Pirate DJ, which I feel I have a little bit of a relationship with, and then moves on to sort of jungle, and now drill, which is going to be something that Malcolm, would I would want to that's one of the questions I want to ask you about. Where do you place drill into sonic intimacy, and does that kind of answer your question about whether sonic intimacy, well, what does intimacy and drill kind of do musically? So that's just a kind of music question. But let me read rather than witter. So I did find a relationship with the book, which was intimate for me, because it spanned my own academic work and also my biography. So the opening of chapter 2 uh, is a reference to the 1981 issue of the New Musical Express, a publication which I think no longer exists. But at that time, it separated those who would consider themselves serious music aficionados from those who are into pop and rock in my schoolyard. So in many ways, some, as I said, would argue that my relationship with the book would end in chapter 2 because the talk of sound systems and reggae. But actually, I feel I can stretch a bit. Um, the 1980s, which I will talk about, Malcolm, because you haven't, represent an era and soundscape which overlaps with a particular type of cultural analysis and theory. And I felt that again in this book that echoes the 1996 volume, Doing Cultural Studies, The Story of the Sony Walkman, in which at that time, what was an incredible technical innovation, portable music, and in many ways, the portability of the sound system in your pocket, for those not able to envision what a Sony Walkman is, um, that portability of music with audio cassettes as the means of playing music and headphones of all sizes, um, in some ways for me, represents a kind of cultural studies work that Malcolm does in this book. And so it was quite profoundly evocative, because I had felt that cultural studies of this kind of come to a demise as the academic study of culture has been kind of pushed into various corners, rather than remaining central in disciplinary terms. And so in some way, this chapter's vibe was intensely located in that tradition of telling the story of British race relations. And I will use relations because of the multiple ways that Malcolm uses it in the book as homage and rewind to the book. The do-it-yourself and illegality of the blues of the pirate radio match so well with the critique of British state racism that is incessant in the book. There's an energy in this analysis which is infectious and immediately led me back to Lee Scratch Perry, who I would have had in my background, but I'll come back to explain the background, because I feel the kind of Lee Scratch Perry moment for me drags me into a kind of inescapable nostalgia, which I think the book tries to evade and avoid, but in a sense, its optimism as a text can't. It has to be nostalgic in some senses, both for the cultural studies moment, but also for me, for that kind of sound system moment also. And even though that optimism of a certain time is maintained throughout the text, even though it's tempered by YouTube trickery, like the bass tones the human ear can't perceive, Malcolm maintains a optimistic outlook, an outlook in which, even though there's a clear despondency and nihilism that is deep in Grimes' outputs and Grimes' contradictions, is maintained. And I think that I think that's actually one of the great strengths of the book. I like books that leave me warm and fuzzy. I like books that leave me thinking, yes, there is a possibility the world is not so bad. But this isn't a nostalgic text with all that associated problems. The book opens with an ethnographic example at a soundstage, which in our totally mediated social feels now strangely alien. The idea of being in a concert, listening to music, feeling those sound vibrations over our bodies. I mean, now it feels that that opening ethnographic moment is not from another time, but actually from another space or dimension. And as the book moves from sound system to radio and through to YouTube videos, the continuity of technological mediation, though not without recognition of difference, and the unmistakable move from optimism to nihilism without losing incessant possibility in alternative modernities, marks this as a really important text, and one that, again, I urge you all to read. But this wouldn't be me without me having some kind of worries or considerations in relationship to the book. And there's really two things that I want to just open as kind of discussions. So this does go to the image that's behind me. So this is the album cover of Handsworth Songs by Steel Pulse. And in some ways, the book, and you make the point in the book here, Malcolm, the book is really about an assertive London sensibility. And I kind of wish that that London sensibility had washed over the whole text. And the reason for that is that I think the optimism that is being signaled in the book recognize the impossibility of a rapprochement with Britishness or Englishness as any spaces of conviviality that are offered, and every space of conviviality that are going to alter those incessant racist rhymes and rhythms that punctuate the book, only happen in urban Britain and at a very local, at a very local level. So where base cultures fundamentally reshaped British society or English society, it is in those spaces of Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, and smaller towns like Bristol, Nottingham, Derby, Peterborough, each with their distinctive sound system stories, and they're distinctive from the one that are told in this book. And I'm kind of conscious that Mukhtar Dar is here on the sound, listening in, an old friend of mine who ran a sound system in Manchester, also worked on several pirate radio stations, no doubt set them up himself. And I'm sure that the Manchester story, and I'm pretty certain that the Manchester story actually does something different in its local telling, but equally performs the same kind of function in disrupting this notion of Britishness or this Englishness. And I suppose I would have wanted this book to say that actually London alters here, that the fabric of British society, the narrative of British society will not alter, and will, you know, in my kind of, you know, the persistence of racism, as I like to call it, means that the alterations that we see in society can never take the name British or English, just as we're seeing with this Merkel, whatever her name is, Merkel and Harry Potter thing that we're going through at the moment. There's a really there's a very hard veneer around the evocation of Britishness and Englishness, which seems to not exist when we can say London or we can say Birmingham. And ultimately, even in your text, it's London and Canary Wharf where you really give us that hyper-capitalist low life distinction in the book, and the way in which grime culture um, rubs up against that, that hyper modernity. Um, and I kind of want to say that maybe there are other alter narratives in other crooks and crannies of urban decline, which signal the kind of potentialities that you want to put on offer. And it then gives us a kind of a bigger argument, because in some ways the narration of race and the nation, which punctuates the book and is really important, is too big. And I kind of wanted the base vibe to break that out into a local story. And this is something I said kind of, I mean, you know, I said quite recently, and Adam's book is coming out, Adam Elliott Cooper's book is coming out, and I kind of sort of also said to him that, look, the Liverpool story and the London story, they do distinct work. They don't do the same work on what we are saying in relationship to nation, nationalism, etc., etc. And I felt that this was in the book, but it could have just, you know, it would have, and I think it would have made the argument much more powerful around conviviality, because, you know, I'm always troubled by that world. So I was really happy it only appeared in chapter 3, to be honest, which is why I say I was stuck a bit in chapter 2. So the other points I want to say is that the brilliance of this book, I've got to say for myself, is the way that you insistently return to the political economy of Britain's urban spaces. And unlike many of the cultural studies books which take music or take the music as a kind of side, this is again punctuated by musical nuance. We get to know about the beat cycles, we get to know about the rhythmic movements, the kinds of way that the music changes, and I felt that was really great. But I felt I was left wondering, where is Malcolm? I love, you know, Malcolm. I love saying, where is Malcolm? And although I'm not a fan of autoethnography, there is a kind of need for a white working class lad to bring himself into the picture, and not as metonymic of the class alliances and convivial forays, but as a locus for some of the critique of the musical cultures and practices, which, due to the absence of Malcolm, seem a little less intrinsic. So the ethnographic moments at the beginning of the book and in the conclusion are the only times in which your presence is felt, even though, of course, your presence is felt throughout the book. But, and here I'm reflecting on my own work, really, that what happens when we don't do this is that when we are exploring masculine musical worlds, and as I said, this is a fault I'm projecting entirely upon my own work on music, is that on reflection, I see that a lot of the optimism and enthusiasm which infuses the text, the warm, fuzzy feeling that I get when I read these kinds of books on masculine music of cultures, is that when we take seriously the absent and occluded women producer artists, the gendered violence concurrent in some sound system and grime spaces, the conviviality of working class and diasporic can be perceived to rest on the shaky ground of masculinity. And I'm not saying that is, but that perception arises. And as I said, I reflect on this in my own work, that the kinds of alternatives that I seek in certain kinds of musicians or certain kinds of musical forms and spaces, as I take a gendered lens, the optimism seems a little less well-founded. And this is a historical thing. So for me, the move from optimism to nihilism in some ways is a gendered journey, because perhaps there was much more nihilism in those optimistic moments, but it's just not visible to those of us who are not participating from that point of view. And I don't want this point to negate police violence and resistance to it, blackmail, incarceration, and educational exclusion, of working class disenfranchisement, because these are all intimately connected to sonic surrounds of taunting and protection. But feminist scholars have taught us that each of these gendered racist actions sit within networks and kin structures that involve women. And it's opening up our masculine musical cultures to that, which I think is incredibly difficult, because I don't think I've managed to achieve that thus far. But the next book on music I write, I hope I'm going to, or the next bit on music I write, I hope I will take that on, because I just think that the story looks less optimistic from that point of view, without wanting to lose, of course, the intense importance of musical cultures for the kinds of politics that you put forward. Thanks. And sorry for moving from the general to the you, but I can see you on the screen, isn't it?
Thanks, Verinda. Malcolm, do you want to respond?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I agree with everything you say, Verinda, and thank you for kind of thinking about it so carefully. I mean, I don't know where to start, really. I mean, maybe I don't know. I wrote down kind of notes about all of it. I mean, where am I? I was in it. I was in it, but I took myself out of it because I don't know. Obviously, like with my previous writing, I was in it because it was more ethnographic and therefore kind of reflexive. So, and in other things that I've written and presented on these themes, I'm also in it. So I have told the story elsewhere of my relationship to it, and part of that is a story of masculinity, as you say. But as I wrote this, I just couldn't find a way of bringing myself into the story that I felt comfortable with, that didn't make it feel like a kind of a bit of a moment of navel gazing, or kind of yeah, I couldn't find a way that I was comfortable with. So you're right, I'm not in the book, but I am in the book because I was, particularly in the kind of jungle chapter, pirate radio chapter, a bit of sound systems as well. Lots of the things that I kind of reflected on were things that I'd kind of lived and done as well, if you know what I mean. The masculinity, I mean, absolutely, and gender. I touch on masculinity like on a few times through the book, and I bring it into the introduction, and I try and talk about the ways in which intimacy from a feminist perspective, and I kind of critique Ralph Ellison's essay on living with music to do that, is the patriarchy associated with kind of technology and certain kinds of violences of sound culture. So I tried to kind of lay it in there, but it is there as a kind of more minor note, and that was just a problem with fitting kind of what I wanted to fit within a relatively short book, as you say. The points on the kind of locational, the more ethnographic, the different stories that are brought about by different spaces, different cities, totally. And I guess partly the kind of, I opted to try and write each chapter conjuncturally, if you want. So like, as you're saying, I'm trying to thread through, not as separate moments, but the different threads, tail ends, new beginnings of capitalism, along with different kinds of things. And that meant that as I wrote it, as I was writing about Jungle Pirate Radio, I was focusing in on that kind of John Major moment. But because it was Jungle Pirate Radio in a certain era, lots of the material I was working with was kind of Southeast, Thames Basin, a bit of Bristol kind of material. Although I note that the Jungle Pirate Radio is bigger than that, and it is and becomes a bit later on Birmingham Sound, a Leicester Sound, a Sheffield Sound, a Liverpool Sound too. But so that's a kind of problem of organization and method, really. But yeah, I acknowledge that. The tape thing, just to kind of go on to different things, I could talk about the other things. The tape thing's interesting. I recently just finished writing a piece on jungle for soundings on with Tom Cordell on Jungle Pirate Radio, and we talk about the tape, and he pointed out to me that the Walkman was launched on the same year that Margaret Thatcher came to power. So there you go. I'll leave it there, Nisha, but I could talk about the other things, but maybe other people want to speak.